around a flag-draped coffin under a sprawling oak tree, with a rugged, silver-haired father, James, standing stoically in a worn jacket, his eyes heavy with loss, beside a young man, Ethan, with tear-streaked cheeks and a trembling resolve, clutching a folded letter, their contrasting emotions capturing the heart-wrenching revelation of love and sacrifice in a story of hidden truths and familial redemption. He thought his son died a hero in battle until his son's husband stood up at the funeral to speak. The church bells tolled like a heartbeat breaking. James Callahan stood in the pew, his weathered hands gripping the oak bench, as the flag-draped coffin gleamed under the stained glass light. His son, Michael, was gone a hero, they said, fallen in a desert half a world away. James had always pictured Michael as the boy who'd climbed the old sycamore in their Georgia backyard, fearless, laughing, his blonde hair catching the sun. A soldier's death fit that boy noble, unwavering, like the stories James told himself to survive the ache. But as the preacher's voice droned, a young man stood, unannounced, at the front of the church. Ethan, his name was, with dark curls and eyes that held a storm. He clutched a folded letter, his hands shaking, and James felt the air shift, heavy with something he couldn't name. "I'm Ethan," the stranger said, voice cracking but resolute. "Michael's husband." The words landed like a grenade, splintering James's world. Whispers rippled through the congregation, but Ethan's gaze held steady, locked on the coffin. James's chest tightened. Husband. Michael had never spoken of this. Not once. James sat frozen as Ethan began to speak, his voice weaving a story James didn't know. Michael, his Michael, had met Ethan 3 years ago at a veterans support group in Atlanta. Ethan, a paramedic with a quick smile and a heart too big for his own good, had been there to help soldiers like Michael process the scars war left behind. They'd fallen in love over late-night coffee, stolen moments in dive bars, and quiet walks along the Chattahoochee River. Michael, Ethan said, was brave not just in battle but in loving fiercely, despite a world that didn't always understand. James's mind reeled. He'd raised Michael alone after Sarah's death, teaching him to fish, to pray, to stand tall. He'd cheered when Michael enlisted, proud of his son's courage. But this, a secret life, a hidden love. James felt betrayed, as if the son he'd known was a ghost. Yet Ethan's words painted Michael alive, laughing at Ethan's terrible cooking, writing poetry in the margins of his field manuals, promising forever in a world that gave them no guarantees. The congregation was a mix of shock and unease. Michael's old football coach shifted uncomfortably. His high school sweetheart, now married with kids, stared at the floor. James wanted to stand, to shout, to demand answers. But Ethan's voice, raw and unyielding, held him captive. "Michael wanted to tell you, James," Ethan said, looking directly at him. "He was afraid you'd turn away." James's throat burned. He remembered the last call from Michael, 6 months ago, his voice distant over the crackling line. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you." Michael had started, but the connection cut out, and James never pressed. Now, that moment haunted him. What had he missed? What had he refused to see? Ethan unfolded the letter, Michael's handwriting jagged across the page. "He wrote this before his last mission," Ethan said. "For you, James." The words were a lifeline and a wound, Dad. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Ethan. I love him. I hope one day you'll understand. I'm still your son." James's vision blurred, tears he hadn't shed in years spilling over. He wanted to hate Ethan, to cling to the Michael he thought he knew. But the truth was a blade, cutting through his pride, As Ethan stepped down, the church fell silent. James stood, legs unsteady, and walked to the coffin. He touched the flag, fingers tracing the stars, and whispered, "I'm sorry, son." The weight of those words, soft love, unspoken, of years lost, crushed him. But in that moment, he saw Michael not as a hero or a stranger, but as a man who'd loved deeply and died too soon. The reception was a blur of casseroles and condolences in the church basement. James stood by the coffee urn, avoiding eyes, his mind stuck on Ethan's speech. People whispered, some kind, some cruel. "Did you know?" a neighbor asked, her voice laced with pity. James shook his head, jaw tight. He didn't know, and that was the worst of it. Ethan lingered by the exit, his coat slung over one arm, looking like he wanted to vanish. James approached, unsure why his feet moved. "You got a minute?" he asked, voice gruff. Ethan nodded, wary, and they stepped outside into the Georgia dusk, the air thick with magnolia and grief. "Why didn't he tell me?" James asked, the question raw. Ethan's eyes softened, but there was steel beneath. "He tried, James. He was scared you'd hate him. You were his hero. Losing you would have broken him." James flinched. He'd raised Michael to be tough, to hide weakness. Had he built a wall so high his son couldn't climb it? "I wouldn't have hated him," James said, but the words felt hollow. He'd grown up in a world where love like Michael's was whispered about, judged, pushed to the shadows. Had he carried that world into his home without knowing? Ethan handed him the letter. "Read it when you're ready," he said. "He loved you, James. More than anything." Then Ethan walked away, his silhouette fading into the twilight. James clutched the letter, its edges sharp against his palm. He didn't open it. Not yet. That night, James sat in Michael's old room, the letter on the dresser. He remembered the boy who'd carved his initials into the bed frame, who'd begged for a dog, who'd hugged him fiercely before deploying. That boy was gone, and so was the man James hadn't known. But the letter was a bridge, fragile but real. To his son, he could still learn to love. James didn't sleep. The letter sat unopened on the kitchen table, glowing faintly under the fluorescent light. Every time he reached for it, his hand froze, as if touching it would unravel the last threads of the son he thought he knew. By dawn, he shoved it into his jacket pocket and drove to the cemetery, where Michael's grave was still a raw wound in the earth. The Georgia morning was heavy with mist, the headstones blurred like ghosts. James knelt by the fresh dirt, his knees sinking into the damp ground. "Why didn't you trust me, Mike?" he whispered. The silence was brutal, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower. He pulled out the letter, hands trembling, and finally tore it open. Michael's words spilled out, messy and urgent. "Dad, I've carried this secret like a weight. Ethan's my home, my heart. I wanted to tell you every time we talked, but I saw the way you looked at guys like me in town hard, like they were less. I couldn't bear you looking at me that way. I'm still the kid who loves you. I just hope you can love all of me." James's chest caved. He'd never said a word against people like Michael, but his silences, his frowns at pride flags, his quick channel changes during news about gay rights had spoken louder. He'd built a cage without knowing, and Michael had lived in it. He drove to Atlanta, Michael's letter burning a hole in his pocket. Ethan lived in a small apartment above a bookstore in Midtown, the kind of place Michael would have loved, with mismatched furniture and shelves stuffed with poetry. James knocked, half hoping no one would answer. But Ethan opened the door, his face pale, eyes red-rimmed. "I read it," James said, holding up the letter. Ethan stepped aside, letting him in. The apartment smelled of coffee and grief, with photos of Michael everywhere laughing at a bonfire, asleep on a couch, kissing Ethan's cheek in a sunlit park. James's throat tightened. This was Michael's life, and he'd missed it. "I didn't know," James said, voice low. "I should have." Ethan sat across from him, hands clasped. "He wanted to tell you, James. He planned to, after this last tour. He thought he'd have time." The word time hung between them, a ghost of missed chances. Ethan told James more how Michael would call from base, whispering about their future, how they'd married in secret at a courthouse, promising to face the world together. James listened, each word a brick in a wall he was starting to tear down. He saw Michael in Ethan's stories not the soldier, not the hero, but a man who loved fiercely, who'd found joy in a world that tried to deny it. "Why'd you speak at the funeral?" James asked. "You could have stayed quiet." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because Michael deserved to be known. All of him. And I couldn't let him go without you knowing who he really was." James nodded, the weight of Ethan's courage settling over him. He'd spent years praising Michael's bravery in battle, but this Ethan standing before a hostile crowd, claiming their love was braver than anything James had ever seen. Back home, James dug through Michael's old things, searching for pieces of the son he hadn't known. He found a journal, its pages filled with Michael's scrawl poems, dreams, fears. One entry stopped him cold. "I want Dad to meet Ethan. I want him to see how happy I am. But what if he doesn't?" James's hands shook. He'd failed Michael, not by hating him, but by never giving him the chance to be whole. He called Ethan the next day, voice rough. "Can I see you again? I want to know him through you." Ethan hesitated, then agreed. They met at a diner, the kind Michael loved, with sticky tables and endless coffee. Ethan brought a box of Michael's things letters, photos, a dog-eared copy of Whitman's poetry. Each item was a window into a life James had been blind to. They talked for hours, James asking questions he'd never dared before. Ethan was patient, his love for Michael spilling into every word. James saw his son and knew not the boy who'd left for war, but the man who'd found love, who'd fought for it in a world that didn't always make room. For the first time, James felt pride, not for the hero, but for the man Michael had become. By dusk, James made a decision. "I want to honor him," he said. "Both of you." Ethan's eyes widened, but he nodded. James didn't know what that meant yet. A memorial, a conversation, a reckoning, but he knew he couldn't let Michael's truth die with him. James woke to the sound of rain, the kind that washed the world clean. He sat at his kitchen table, Michael's journal open before him, its pages worn from nights of reading. Each word was a piece of his son. He hadn't known dreams of a house with Ethan, fears of rejection, love that burned brighter than war. James had spent weeks wrestling with guilt, but today, he felt something new, resolve. He drove to the community center where Michael and Ethan had met, a squat brick building tucked between Atlanta's skyscrapers. The support group still met there, veterans and their families sharing stories of loss and healing. James hesitated at the door, his work boots heavy on the linoleum. He wasn't a soldier, wasn't one of them, but he was Michael's father, and that was enough. Inside, a circle of chairs held a mix of faces, young, old, scarred, hopeful. A woman with a prosthetic leg nodded as he sat. The facilitator, a soft-spoken man named Leo, welcomed him. "You here for someone?" Leo asked. James swallowed. "My son, Michael. He was here, with Ethan." Whispers passed through the group, but they weren't cruel. They knew Ethan, knew Michael. James felt exposed but anchored. He spoke haltingly, telling them about Michael, the boy who'd loved baseball, the soldier who'd died, the man who'd loved Ethan in secret. I didn't know him, James admitted, voice breaking. Not all of him. I'm here to learn. The group listened, their silence a kind of grace. A young veteran named Tara shared her story of coming out to her family, the fear and the freedom. James saw Michael in her, and it hurt, but it also healed. Ethan joined him at the next meeting, sitting quietly at his side. They didn't speak much, but their shared presence was a bridge. Afterward, Ethan invited James to a vigil for fallen soldiers, organized by the group. It was held in a park, fairy lights strung through the trees, casting a warm glow over photos of the lost. Michael's picture sat among them, his smile bright, Ethan's arm around him in the frame. James stood before it, tears falling freely now. I'm proud of you, son, he whispered. Ethan overheard, his own eyes wet. He'd have loved hearing that, Ethan said. They stood together, the crowd's murmurs fading into the night. James realized he wasn't just mourning Michael, was mourning the years he'd spent blind to his son's truth. The vigil sparked something in James. He wanted to do more, to make Michael's love mean something beyond the grave. He and Ethan began planning a scholarship in Michael's name for LGBTQ veterans struggling to find their place. It was small, funded by James's savings and donations from the group, but it felt right. They called it the Michael Callahan Fund, and Ethan insisted James be the one to announce it. At the launch, held in the same community center, James stood before a small crowd. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. My son was a hero, he said. Not just for his service, but for his heart. This is for him, and for everyone like him, who deserve to be seen. The applause was soft but real, and Ethan's hand on his shoulder was a quiet anchor. Back home, James found a letter from Michael's old unit, tucked in a box he hadn't opened. It was from Michael's commanding officer, detailing his final Miss Iona rescue under fire, saving 3 men before a roadside bomb took him. The letter called him brave, selfless. James had read it before, but now he saw it differently. Michael's courage wasn't just in battle, it was in living his truth, in loving Ethan despite the risks. He called Ethan, asking him to come over. When Ethan arrived, James handed him the letter. You should have this, he said. You were his family too. Ethan's fingers traced the words, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you, James. For the first time, James felt like he was giving Michael back to the man who'd loved him most. They sat on the porch, the Georgia night alive with crickets. James told Ethan stories: Michael's first fish, his high school pranks, his stubborn pride. Ethan shared his own Michael's terrible puns, his secret fear of thunderstorms, his dream of opening a bookstore. They laughed, cried, built a bridge across their grief. James realized he wasn't just keeping Michael alive, he was finding a new family in Ethan. The scholarship grew, slowly but steadily, drawing attention beyond Atlanta. A local paper ran a story, calling it a beacon for veterans who felt invisible. James clipped the article, tucking it into Michael's journal. He wasn't used to praise, but it felt like a piece of Michael shining through. Ethan, meanwhile, threw himself into the work, meeting with donors, speaking at events. His fire reminded James of Michael, and it both hurt and healed to see. But not everyone was kind. At a town hall where James spoke about the fund, a man in a flannel shirt stood, his voice sharp. This ain't what heroes do, he said, spitting the word heroes like a curse. Your son shamed his uniform. The room tensed, but James didn't flinch. My son loved someone, he said, voice steady. That's braver than anything I ever did. The man sat, silenced, and James felt Michael's strength in his own spine. Ethan faced worse. Online, anonymous comments called him names James couldn't repeat. One night, someone slashed the tires of Ethan's car, leaving a note, "Freak." James found him in the parking lot, staring at the damage, his face a mask of exhaustion. You don't have to do this, James said. Ethan shook his head. I'm doing it for him. For us. James nodded, helping Ethan change the tires, their hands working in quiet sync. They started visiting Michael's grave together, every Sunday. It became a ritual, coffee and thermoses, stories of Michael, the weight of loss lighter with each trip. One day, Ethan brought a small pride flag, placing it by the headstone. James tensed, old instincts flaring, but he saw the love in Ethan's gesture. He'd have liked that, James said, surprising himself. Ethan smiled, and for a moment, they were just two men missing the same heart. James began attending pride events with Ethan, at first as a silent supporter, then as a voice. He spoke at a rally in Savannah, his voice shaking but clear. I lost my son before I knew him, he said. Don't wait to love the people in your life. Don't wait to see them. The crowd cheered, and Ethan hugged him, a fierce, fleeting embrace. James felt like he was finally becoming the father Michael needed. At home, James hung a photo of Michael and Ethan in the living room, next to one of Michael as a boy. It was a small act, but it felt like a vow to honor all of his son, not just the parts he'd understood. Neighbors noticed, some raising eyebrows, others offering quiet nods. James didn't care. He was done hiding. Ethan invited James to a poetry reading at the bookstore below his apartment, a place Michael had loved. The room was packed, the air thick with incense and hope. Ethan read a poem Michael had written, its lines raw and aching. Love is a battlefield, quiet but fierce, where we win by being seen. James's eyes burned, seeing his son in every word. Afterward, a young woman approached, thanking them for the scholarship. It saved me, she said, voice trembling. James realized this was Michael's legacy, not just medals, but lives changed. He and Ethan grew closer, their bond forged in shared loss and purpose. James helped Ethan fix up the apartment, painting walls, building shelves for Michael's books. Ethan taught James to cook Michael's favorite chili, laughing when James burned the first batch. They were family, not by blood but by choice, and James clung to that. One night, Ethan confessed his fear that he was betraying Michael by moving forward. James took his hand, something he'd never done. You're not betraying him, he said. You're keeping him alive. Ethan nodded, tears falling, and James felt the weight of his own words. They were both learning to live with love, not just loss. A year after the funeral, James stood at Michael's grave. The pride flag faded but still bright against the stone. Ethan was beside him, holding a new photo, a candid of them laughing at the diner. A moment of joy captured. He'd want us to keep going, Ethan said, placing the photo by the flag. James nodded, his heart full and heavy. The scholarship had grown, funding 5 veterans now, each with stories like Michael's lives hidden, then freed. James and Ethan ran it together, their work a testament to Michael's love. They faced pushback, angry letters, whispered slurs, but they also found allies, the community center, local businesses, even Michael's old unit, who donated in his name. James spoke at schools, sharing Michael's story, his voice stronger each time. He told kids about love, about courage, about seeing people for who they are. Ethan joined him sometimes, his paramedics calm, grounding James's fire. They were a team, carrying Michael's light into a world that needed it. One spring evening, James hosted a barbecue, the backyard alive with faces from the support group, the scholarship recipients, even some neighbors who'd come around. Ethan manned the grill, his laughter echoing as he teased James about his grilling skills. The air smelled of charcoal and hope, and James felt Michael there, in the warmth, in the love. A young man from the scholarship, Javier, raised a glass. "To Michael," he said, "and to James and Ethan, for giving us a chance to be ourselves." The toast rippled through the crowd, and James met Ethan's eyes, seeing the same quiet pride. They'd built something lasting, something Michael would have loved. Later, James found Ethan by the sycamore tree, where Michael used to climb. "I think he's proud of us," Ethan said, voice soft. James nodded, his hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I know he is." They stood there, the stars bright above, and James felt a peace he hadn't known possible. The next morning, James wrote a letter to Michael, something he'd never done. "Son, I see you now. All of you. I'm sorry I didn't before, but I'm learning. Ethan's teaching me, and so are you. I love you. Always." He tucked it into the journal, next to Michael's words, and placed it on the shelf. James and Ethan kept going speaking, fundraising, living. They weren't perfect. Grief still caught them off guard, and the world wasn't always kind. But they had each other, and they had Michael's legacy. James had thought his son died a hero in battle, but he'd been wrong. Michael's true heroism was in his love, his truth, and the family he'd left behind to carry it forward. In the quiet of his home, James hung a new photo of him, Ethan, and Michael's picture, framed together. It was a family portrait, imperfect but whole. And as the Georgia sun rose, James knew he'd spend the rest of his life making sure Michael's love was never forgotten.